Good morning. I'm reading from 1 Peter 3, verses 1 to 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered.
Is it wrong that I like that you're all squirming when I read that stuff? I love it. So, why is it that we have been uncomfortable since chapter 2 verse 13? Well, the reason is because Peter is speaking about what does it mean to be a Christian, and then how does that Christianity push itself into our relationships with one another and with our world. And so he is systematically going through different sorts of relationships. He started with our relationship with our government, or the rulers. Then he talks about work relationships, servants and masters. And now he's into marriage. And the common thread through all of it that makes you so upset is the word submission. And we hate it, right? Which is kind of strange. So let me just expose something here. You don't hate submission, you love it. The problem is not that you don't submit. I'll give you some examples. Every time I'm outside or I go to an event, I see, let me use women as an example at first, and I'm going to hammer men today, just so you know, but women first. Every time you are wearing high heels, you are submitting to something. Pain, exactly. Yes. You are, listen, you submit to something you don't particularly like. Why? Because the vanity of wanting to look good or to conform to the way I should look at an event. And so you submit to the pain, the cost, I don't know what happens after you take them off. It's probably relief, I would imagine, and then probably some more pain. I don't know. It looks terribly painful. And so you submit to those. Why? Well, you submit. We submit to all kinds of things. We submit to diets. We submit to laws. We submit constantly. The problem is not submission. The problem is the master. You want to be your own master. You have no problem submitting so long as it's on my terms. I decide when I submit and when I don't. And this has been aided in our minds by the ancients and by the last few hundred years of thinking that has influenced all of us. We don't want to submit. So the Bible's actually 100% right in Psalm 2 when God talks about the nations and says, this is what they say. Let us burst the bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. See, the world says, take this yoke off my neck. I don't want to be submitted to anyone but myself. I am captain of my fate, master of my soul. That's what the world says. And so, is it any wonder then that marriage is a problem to our modern age? Right? Marriage has been reviled lately as unnatural, unnecessary, a relic. It's been called abusive. If you're on the extreme feminist side, there's folks who will say marriage was actually just created by men to legalize slavery. We wanted to be masters over women, so we created this institution and made it sound lovely and protective, but in truth is all we are slave masters, us men. That's the only reason it exists. And I can actually appreciate why the world has soured on marriage a little bit, because a big problem is this. Men have proven so unworthy of trust and submission. But may I say as well, so have you women. We all have, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. But let's say this as well. Mary Wollstonecraft was she's a thinker. Her daughter was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And she was a thinker. She was a women's rights activist. She wrote a book called Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in it, I think she captures the spirit of our age very well, even though it was a couple hundred years ago. She says, I love man as my fellow, but his scepter, real or usurped, extends not to me, unless the reason of an individual demands my homage. And even then, the submission is to reason and not to man. And so we can dress it up in all the words we want, Miss Wollstonecraft, There's many people who say this. The simple fact of the Bible is, yes, of course, we understand what you're saying. You want to be your master. You want to decide. And this isn't even about men being your master. You want to be sole guide for your life. This isn't just women, it's all humanity. And this plagues us. This desire to want to be our own slaves, our own masters, and slave to nothing but ourselves is all over. And so, this is why the gospel, this is why Christian idea of marriage, it's interesting, right? The Christian idea of marriage has all at once been reviled, and yet it also has transformed the world. Every religion marries. Just for the record, there's never been a culture in human history that didn't marry. Every culture always assumed you didn't just go around sleeping with whoever you want and doing what you wanted. There was always some kind of marriage. Christian marriage comes and does something radical. It clashes with the culture and transforms it, always. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to see that what Peter is unpacking here is a model for marriage that offers a complete alternative to what the world thinks about marriage. In every generation, it's been the same. In Peter's time and in ours. And so what he is presenting here is a vision of marriage that affirms our culture, challenges it, and then attracts it. Okay, so let me walk through those three things. That the biblical model of marriage affirms something, challenges something, and attracts, well, hopefully all of us. So let's begin with what it affirms. So first, let's say this. Peter's words here wouldn't have shocked many people in the Roman Empire, Christian or not. The average pagan Roman picking up Peter's letter or being in the audience hearing it read wouldn't have said, oh, how radical. Not generally. It's radical. It really is. You're going to see. But on the surface, Peter does something. He affirms things that are already going on in the culture. And I'll explain why he does that in a minute, but let me show you what he affirms. So, first he affirms this sense of authority. Every culture in history, at that time especially, and up until recently, has assumed that men have a very unique place in the leadership of a family. Every culture thought it. And so when he comes and says women are to have a certain role and men to have a certain role, he's not being very radical. He's actually affirming what the Romans would have thought. And what they would have thought is something akin, though not quite, to what we might call complementarianism today. And what that means is this assumption that men and women are different. They're different, not in value necessarily, but they are different. That men are a certain sort of creature and women another. And the Romans understood this, so does Peter. And so he's affirming, he's saying, that part we can agree on. But what he is saying to women, however, is this. He's saying, listen, men have a unique place as leaders of their family. And wives, you can have your own beliefs about religion. You can believe, because he's actually talking to women, at first anyway, who are married to men who are not Christians. And he says, have your beliefs, but here's what you cannot do as a Christian woman. You cannot allow your Christianity to become an excuse to shame your husband and to mock him and to bring him derision in the culture. And we think, boy, is that fair? Well, don't worry, we'll talk much more about that in a minute. But let me give you examples of what Peter is probably thinking about at the time. In Rome, it was assumed that when you got married, if you're a woman, your gods became whatever the man's gods were. The man determined the household religion. And so if you didn't have the same faith, which is possible, it was what you didn't do is go flaunt it outside. So you would still be expected to show a united face with your husband and the family when he went to the events. And you could have your own faith, but what you don't do is do something that culturally will have people saying, gosh, that guy does not have a tight role in his family. And so what Peter seems to be saying here is not saying bend over backwards and sin. We've covered that. What we're not being told is submit to sin. But what he is saying is Christianity and Christ does not triumph with the shame of other people. And so he's actually subtly, because he doesn't prescribe, he doesn't say, here's exactly what you should do. Go to these ceremonies, but not those. Do this, but don't do that. He's leaving a remarkable amount of room for the couple to talk and to discern and to work things out together. And he's saying, all that you need to worry about is that your job is to not allow this to become a scandal in the community so that the family loses face, the husband loses face, and everybody, and there's tension and strife in the family. So when he says that, he's agreeing with the culture. And listen, Peter's not agreeing with the culture entirely. That's point 2, but first we have to keep going. He also doesn't say, go ahead and divorce your husband because he has different religious beliefs. He doesn't say that. So in doing that, he is affirming the cultural assumption that marriage is important. Believe it or not, the Romans did think that marriage was important. Yes, there were scoundrels, of course, but he's affirming something. Then he also says this. He says, let your conduct behave in such a way, be so pure, behave so much like Christ that your husband who doesn't believe will be converted, hopefully. Now, he's not being naive. He knows that doesn't always happen. But what he is saying is something important, because culturally, women, I don't know what people think. I think the culture maybe makes us think that the Roman women were just being cowering all the time. It's not the case. The Romans were not horrible people all the time, right? And so what happens is women and men had very free dialogue, husbands and wives. But what wasn't acceptable culturally was for the woman to treat the man like a child. That was not seen very well in that light. So a woman can correct her husband, but not in such a way as to lecture him like a child, as some women and some men are prone to doing to each other, right? We go a little far at times. And what he is saying is, don't even be a hint of that. So you correct him without a word, he's saying. So that you don't go too far, because it's so hard for us to correct people without lording over them and making them feel small, maybe what you should do is focus first on living so well that that becomes your tool of correcting him, okay? So in this regard, he's affirming something. Listen, it's not all Peter's saying. He's going far more radical than just this, but that's a start. So nobody, Roman men reading this is like, all right, I can tolerate this, and so could a woman. She's like, okay, it flies with culture. But he's also affirming virtues of the Roman world. So the culture, it wasn't just the Christians. Romans, for a long time, and Greeks had long said that the focus of every person, women and men, is to focus on internal beauty, not external. So this is not new. I didn't bring them up, but I could bring up Xenophon and Aristotle, these two philosophers who speak directly about this and say these things. And so it was understood that, yes, it's okay to wear makeup, it's okay to look good when you go out, but don't let that become the idol it can easily become. So the Greeks understood this. Now, they had an interesting view of cosmetics. And cosmetics and finery, they said, and I know we had a good discussion about this on Tuesday, cosmetics can enhance the beauty of someone, but it can also conceal an ugliness in them. And so there was this lingering assumption in the ancient world that someone who is really dolled up is concealing something. Because the seductress is always beautifully adorned and smells like great perfume. And you have to wonder, well, that packaging looks too good. If it looks too good to be true, it may be too good to be true. It's like a timeshare, right? And so there's this underlying assumption in the culture that, hey, it's good, you should go out and you should look good. But hold on now. Because it's not just that it can be seductive, but there was also a sense, not a sense, it's reality, where the wealthy classes would dress in such a way as to lord their wealth over others. And so because of that, Peter is doing exactly what the culture says, which is just be careful about that. Make sure that your focus is internal, not external. That's pretty basic. He's affirming a pretty generic, we would all say the same thing today to people. And then he does something else. When he says that husbands should show respect for their wives, this is not uncommon. The Romans and Greeks were not horrible to their wives. Plutarch says plainly, the husband ought to show no greater respect for anyone than his wife. And so he is affirming this idea, right? That's good. The problem isn't that. He affirms parts of the culture, but he's going far. There's something more radical he's doing. But before we move into the challenging, let me say this. What he is doing here is showing how secure and how confident and at peace a Christian ought to be compared to everybody else in the world. Let me use an example of what I mean by this. There's this wonderful play, one of my favorites. They made a movie of it called Amadeus, right? We know the movie from the 80s. And Peter Schaefer wrote it, and I think it's in the movie, but it's certainly in the play. And so the story is this. There's a guy named Salieri, and he is the greatest composer in the Austrian Empire. And everything's going really well for him. Yeah, he's the apple of everybody's eye, all the accolades, until a kid named Mozart shows up. And he realizes quickly that Mozart is much better than him, but he can't admit it. And so the first time he hears Mozart play is at the Archbishop's palace. And when he hears Mozart playing something, he says, oh my goodness, this is the voice of God. It's nothing, this is unheard of. But then he realizes Mozart, although he's an incredible musician, is a scandalous human being. He's running around with women, he's drinking, he's bad with money, he's despicable. And so Salieri, who's a very good legalist, says it had to be an accident. This must be a one-hit wonder, because there's no way God would give talent like this to this scoundrel of a human being. It must be a mistake. It must be a monkey, just a performing monkey. That's what he is, he calls him. So It works. He can believe that for a while, but at one point in this play, he gets a copy of Mozart's sheet music. And he says, "Oh, are these the copies?" And his wife says, "No, these are the originals." And he says, "Hold on, there's no corrections on it." And she says, he doesn't make corrections. So what this means is Mozart hears music in his head, puts it on paper, and it never needs to be corrected. Never a mistake. And listen, if you've read, I don't think any of you could even craft an email without correcting it 10 times and asking a husband or a wife to look at it. So when he sees this, he's, "Oh my goodness." And here's what his response is. "It was clear to me. That sound I had heard in the Archbishop's palace had been no accident. Here again was the very voice of God. I was staring through the cage of those meticulous ink strokes at an absolute, imitable beauty." And what it is this. Salieri says this privately. He cannot admit it publicly. Do you know why? Because to affirm and to say that Mozart was greater than him would mean he would lose something. It means I'm no longer the greatest. I can't affirm him being up here without me going down there, and I can't do that. So what does he do? The whole play is about him engineering to kill Mozart. He can't do it. You see, this is the problem with pride and with insecurity. It cannot allow anything to rise above you, ever. Now, this is why I bring this up here. What Peter is doing here by saying, listen, there's some parts of the Roman culture which are not bad, they're good. He is affirming something, and he has such security that he can say, I can say these parts are noble in the culture without feeling like I'm approving of all of it. And if you don't know what I mean, think about how we approach politics today. Have you ever heard somebody on the left or on the right praise the other side? It doesn't matter if the right cures cancer, the left will not give them credit, and vice versa. Why? Because if I give them an inch, if I affirm a goodness in them, then people are going to think they're good, but they're not good. See, the only way to be what Peter is doing here, which is to say, listen, there is some nobility in the world apart from the church. And I know that sounds odd, but this is why he can say it. Because Christianity believes in something called common grace. That God is not merely gracious to Christians, but he's poured out his grace. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. And therefore, you can see elements of good things and nobility and virtue in the world, even if it's been misled. Let me give you many examples. Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun was brave. Adolf Hitler was brave. See what happens when you say that? Doesn't sound good, does it? That doesn't mean he's right and good, but it doesn't also mean that we should say, no, they weren't brave. You know, one of the silly things I remember learning was I was told when I was a kid that bullies were cowards. No, they're not. That's the movies say that, but go ahead and punch a bully, see what happens. You get punched, because you know why? I was that bully. So I know it. The bully, see, there's no shame in saying Attila the Hun was brave, still a scoundrel, still a sinner who was using it wrongly. There's no shame in saying Jimi Hendrix was the best guitarist ever. No debate. No debate. Right? Was he a Christian? No. Did he die of a drug overdose because he had wrong priorities and loves? Of course. Was he a womanizer? Yeah. But an incredible musician. And I haven't lost something. I haven't conceded any ground to the church, to the world when I say that. There's nothing wrong with saying The Godfather is an excellent movie. It is an excellent bit of cinematography. Doesn't mean I approve of everything that happens in it. And so we have to learn to grow up as Christians. Because part of the evangelism of the church historically has been its ability to do what the culture will not. I am so secure, Peter is so secure in saying, listen, the culture is not all wrong. Men and women are different. We do have different roles. We should love and honor one another. We should do everything we can to give respect and honor to our wives and husbands. And he affirms that part. He doesn't go much further, but he affirms it because that's what we should be doing. And if we did the same thing, and when I'm on campuses and I talk to people and they say, I'm struggling with gender dysphoria, the church wants me to hammer that person. I will not. I'll say, you know what's the best thing you're doing is searching to figure out who you are. You're looking in the wrong places. But that pursuit of identity is good. Let's figure out how to get you where you should be. How do you know who you are? And that's where we move. Affirming the good in the world does not mean you affirm all of the world. So that's one thing Peter does, which Christians have done historically and done it really well. Second thing is challenge. Now, this one's more challenging. And so, skeptics, right? Skeptics and non-believers will read this passage, and even many Christians, and say, Gosh, look at Peter. He's just affirming the age-old patriarchy. He's just taking this ancient idea, and Carl, you're here in the 21st century trying to perpetuate man's dominance of women. I understand, I do. But can I say that that's an intellectually dishonest approach? Let's try to figure out what Peter's actually saying before we make this assumption. And before we do it, you know what? I'm not going to talk about wives yet. I'll talk about husbands first. There's 7 verses that Annette read to us. 6 of them are for women, 1 for man. Right away, the women are like, what? 6? Men get 1? That's why I'm going to start with the men, because I actually think this will be just as unpopular as everything I say, but I think the Bible is far harder on men than it is on women. Far harder. That doesn't mean we, as men, haven't been terrible towards women. But scripturally, let me use an example of just that one little verse. So, yes, Peter says, men, like it or not, he says, they have been given a different authority, not a different value, but a different authority. This is their task, to lead the family well. And then he starts to challenge what we think by that, because you hear authority to lead and you think slavery, you think domination, you think all these things. Let's listen to what Peter has to say. First, he starts that one verse by saying, likewise. Now, it's interesting. What does likewise mean? Well, likewise, the moment you see that, you have to read the verse before it, because he's saying, whatever I said before, and likewise do this. So to understand what he means, you have to go back. And if you keep going back, you realize this goes all the way back to chapter 2, verse 13, when he says, everybody, you are to obey your rulers, your government officials, and those put over you. Why? For the sake of God. Now, every subsequent relationship after that, he says the same thing. Likewise, likewise, likewise. And what he is saying is this: men, this is why it's so subverting of the culture. Yes, it's true. Men have been given headship of the family. However, they don't have supreme authority. God does. You lead as a surrogate. You've been given derivative authority. You can lead this family, but make no mistake, you submit to God, who is the leader of you. That is subverting the culture. See, Rome would say the man is the head with an iron fist. Christianity says man is the head, but he is not free to do as he pleases. He is subject to God. And that very thing is radical, but let's keep moving. The next thing he says is showing honor to the woman. And this word, I love it in the Hebrew or the Greek, it means to assign value. So he's saying, listen, in your role, men, as leading your households, you are to show, don't just pretend, show honor. And it means to ascribe value. So show that this person has value by the way you behave towards them. It's activity. It's not just, well, I bring home the bacon and I protect, my money pays the bills, and if somebody breaks in, I'll be the one to fight. That's the two things. That's my job as a man. No, that is an anemic, silly way of thinking about men being a man. What he means here is all those things that it means to show honor to the woman, remembering that God is your model. How does God honor you and that woman and us and the church? It's much more. He provides and protects, but he also speaks well of the woman, his wife, and to her. Men, you should be praising your wives in public. Praising it, not because it's a lie, but you have to realize she's tolerated you for a long time. I'm speaking from very intimate knowledge here. But no, we should be speaking well of them. One of the best ways to honor our parents and one another and our spouses is to speak well of them in public. I have a lot of unbelieving friends. I go golfing with them every year. And if they're listening to this, I'm sorry, guys, you know who you are. They don't honor their wives. They don't. It's oftentimes that after a couple of beers on the patio, they start talking about, gosh, can you believe this? She's stifling me. Thank goodness someone is stifling you. But it doesn't just mean, but it does mean doting. We should dote on our wives the way Christ dotes on us. But not just this, we're also leading her, as you're going to see in a minute. So there is a sense where we are careful. We have to hold our wives accountable. We have to care for them enough to intercede and to speak into their lives. And you'll see they do the same to us. He moves on. He then says this very popular phrase, they are the weaker vessel. You love that one, right? Listen, Aristotle again, Xenophon, every ancient Greek says the exact same thing. And you know what they mean every time they say it? They're almost never speaking about value. They're talking about physical strength. All of them, Aristotle and Xenophon specifically, I read this week, both of them say, listen, they would be shocked to hear what we're doing today. Because they say, It's not really disputable here. Men are not just physically stronger, but something is different about us. We like fighting. We like an adventure. We don't even think about certain acts of bravery and things. And because we are those things, accept what nature and God has done and live out those things well. That's what they're saying. So it's actually incredible. What Peter is saying here is he's saying this. Because you are stronger, that strength is there not to dominate, but to serve. In the same way Christ, who is all-powerful, didn't dominate you, but won you by being everything you needed, by serving and dying for you. And it's not merely physical here, because there's also an element of social weakness. Women in the ancient times were socially weaker. They didn't have the same power. At Advent, we're going to preach through the book of Ruth, and you're going to see that on display with Boaz. What does Boaz do with his power when Ruth is not powerful in the culture? He uses his power for her. That's what men do. Men say, look at all the things God has given me. How do I then now put it at the service of my family? That's what a man should be doing. And why? Listen how far he goes. The culture would have agreed with that, by the way. The culture of Rome would have agreed and said, that's what men should do, of course. Here's where they differ. Peter then says the ridiculous thing of saying, because they are heirs with us. You know why it says with us there? Because the word there is syncleronomo, which don't worry about the word. But one means heir, but the sin, S-Y-N, at the front means together. What he is saying is we're co-heirs. Here's where Christianity breaks every culture's rules, including the modern skeptic who has problems with Christianity here. What he is saying is we are 100% equal in value and dignity before God. We're co-heirs. There's no difference between us before God. So, while yes, there's a difference in strength and in calling and in character and nature, then that's okay. We have those. But none of those amount to a difference in value or dignity. We are co-heirs. We're equally loved and have the same inheritance in Christ. And by doing that, he breaks from the culture and challenges it. Because the culture, even these noble pagans we call them, Aristotle, Plato, all of them, would have all said, yeah, women are equal with us, but come on. Not so equal. Some are a little more equal than others, as they say in Animal Farm, right? And so when he says this, he's radically breaking from the ancient culture. Now, I don't even know where the heck I am. Here we go. Yes. Now, here's the model. I'll close this part on husbands here. If you want to know a very simple model for what it means to be a husband, it's this. Ephesians 5:25-27 covers it all. Let me just read it. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And so, ask this question. Why did Christ marry you? Why? Why does God do it? He says, love your wives as Christ. And then he describes how Christ and why Christ married us. He didn't find nice people who just needed a freshening up. He found dirty people who need to be cleaned, crooked people who need to be straightened, miserable people who need to be made glorious. So he married us purely for our sake. And then he cleans us up to make us like him for himself. Now, if that's my job as a husband, to mirror that, to be reenacting the gospel towards my wife and towards my children, then that means my job, first and foremost, is to make my wife glorious. My job is to take her and say, how do I make it so I got her in one way? We married each other as very handsome but foolish young people. And so we do this, and then how do I say, at the end of all things, God, here is what I've done with what you've given me. That's my job, every moment to reassess and do inventory and say, how do I make her radiant? The word is radiant. When it says to present the church to himself in splendor, it's the word doxa, which is this radiance. How do I do that? How do I today lay down my self-interest to make her radiant, make my kids radiant? And if this is what I am doing, then I love her by protecting her, speaking well of her, blessing her, sacrificing for her, and holding her accountable so that she's a better, obedient Christian tomorrow than she was today. That's my job as a husband. And I'll leave this here for the men. If you find yourself demanding submission from your wife, perhaps you should focus more on being worthy of submission. This is the key. I often see men, I'm not knocking us, right? Yes, women are told to submit, but there's times where I have to tell men, Can you understand why she doesn't want to submit? You are not doing you're not even trying to be what Christ is making you. You've got a different idea of what marriage is. What Christ demands of us is high. Now, you as well, let's turn to wives now. Wives will say, yeah, if my husband did what you're saying, I'd follow him. But he's not, right? Listen, I do a lot of marriage counseling. I've done marriage counseling for years. This is usually a big problem here, is the man, I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's not because it's bad, just because I don't have time. And you may have heard this before. In Genesis, when the curse comes to the woman, what is the curse in Genesis 3? It is your desire will be for your husband, but he will master you, right? Those two words, desire and master, are only ever put together again in the very next chapter of Genesis with Cain. And God says to Cain, Cain, sin's desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, let's look at Cain for a minute. If sin is prowling there and its job, it wants to usurp you, is what the wording is. It wants to take over. It wants to take what you think and know it to be good, and it wants to destroy it and make you do bad. Its desire is for you in that way. It wants to usurp your heart. But you must crush it, Cain. You have to resist it. Now, if we take that language and go back, what is the curse on Eve? Eve, your desire is going to be to usurp your husband. You're going to see that this man who is now a sinner cannot lead you the way he should. And you're going to say, I have to do it myself, or I'll own a kangaroo farm tomorrow. If I let him run the money, what are we going to do with our money? If I let him run things, where will we be? And so what is your desire? To be him. But he will not know how to lead a woman who doesn't submit. What's he going to do then? Master you. He's going to try. He doesn't know what else to do. What do I do when I was a kid and I have a block that won't fit in the hole? I just cram it in there, right? I never think to move it around. I'm just like, "Rrr." And this is the problem. And so women, I understand, and I actually sympathize with you. Men are not usually worthy of submission. Okay, I could end the sermon here, but I won't. Because what does Peter say? Peter does something so incredible, I don't think we spend enough time on it, and I won't be able to. He says, if you want an example of what we mean by submission, look at Sarah and Abraham, which is a strange place to go. Because if you know the story of Sarah and Abraham, he says she called him Lord. She never, ever once calls him Lord, except for once when it's in passing saying, I'm old and so is my Lord, and now we're going to have a baby. So she never actually does it. In Genesis, she is never said to use, using the word anyway, to submit or obey Abraham. But 3 times he obeys her. So what the heck's going on? What does he mean? Sarah and Abraham become this model marriage for the early church and for Israel. Why? Well, let me use 3 examples to show you how Christian view of marriage is so much more robust than you ever give it credit for, and certainly if you're a skeptic, you ever gave it credit for. And I'll use 3 very quick stories because I don't have time. First one is there in Genesis 12. Here's the story. Abraham and Sarah journey into Egypt. And Abraham realizes, I have a very beautiful wife. And I am worried, Sarah, he says, that people will see and you'll be so beautiful, they'll kill me so they can have you. Now, you may say, is that realistic? First 2 things. 1, David killed Uriah for his wife. Maybe not as crazy as you think. 2, the Jewish scribes of the time, and it's written there so we know it, said that Sarah was so beautiful that every other woman looked like a monkey compared to her. Now that's pretty attractive there. And so I'll just leave that there for you. Now, so he says, here's his big plan. My big plan is this, Sarah, pretend to be my sister. And then nobody will kill me because I'm just your brother. Of course it does. And she says, okay. She submits. She agrees to go along with this cockamamie plan. Why? What's going on here? First, let me say this. Let us not judge her too harshly, nor should we judge anyone in this room when the couples make decisions that we would never make and find baffling. For a number of reasons. But one reason is this. You don't know, we're not told how much anguish she felt. We don't know how much it terrified her to be without a husband in a culture that was not kind to women without men. We have no idea all the behind-the-scenes discussions that went on. We read it in one verse, and we think, he's an idiot, and so is she. Not fair. How many times have people that we know made decisions, and you're like, I would never have made that decision? Have some sympathy. Every day, we as married couples make difficult decisions, some more difficult than others, and everybody else would think it's baffling, but they have worked together to discern the will of God. So let's not be too hard on poor Sarah here. But what we can say is this: she submits to something, knowing, and eventually it does, bring incredible hardship to everybody, many people, and I won't go into the story. It proves to be a very questionable decision, let's just say. Here's what I do know, and we have to move on. This: Sarah trusted God and submitted to Abraham. Those are different things. She submits to Abraham because she trusts God. Not that everything will go well if she agrees to this plan, but she trusts that God is sovereign. She knows this: I have to submit to my husband. That's what God has demanded of me. And the extent to which I honor my husband is the extent to which I honor God. I must honor my husband if I want to honor God. Therefore, if this is going to go well or poorly with me, I must trust God knows what he's doing, even if it hurts me. Very difficult to do. She trusts God, but submits to Abraham. They're not the same. You don't have to trust your husband all the time and his judgment. Sometimes you're thinking, this is a bad decision. And sometimes you're wrong, as you're going to see as well. But the key is her trust for God allowed her to submit to Abraham. Let's move on. There's another story. Sarah then, in 4 chapters later, decides this: we're supposed to be having a baby, Abraham, but there's no baby coming. And so here's a great plan. Sarah comes up with a good one now. Here's this: let's take my slave, let's take this slave Hagar, and you go and be intimate with her, and she will become a surrogate. Therefore, we will fulfill God's plan through our effort. Every commentator in the world says we can sympathize with her, but she was foolish to make this suggestion. But Abraham probably should have piped up and said, maybe we should just trust God. Maybe we should just not try to force his hand. Let's instead trust that what he said he will bring about, that we won't have to bring it about. Doesn't happen, of course. And what is the result? The moment this happens, Hagar begins to despise Sarah, because in the ancient world, to not have a baby, this was incredible burden, incredible stigma attached. It still is. There still is, unfortunately, a stigma for people who cannot have children or struggle to. There's a sense where you can still feel less than. It's unfortunate. Imagine now in the ancient world. So Sarah, let's sympathize with her. She is struggling. She has not been. In fact, did you know there's actually a written document from the 19th century BC that says if my wife doesn't provide a baby, an heir, within 2 years, I can divorce her. This is 4,000 years ago. We've been doing this for a long time. And so let's have some sympathy with her again, but also be honest enough to say, poor decision. So what does this tell us? Women had freedom to speak to their husbands and propose things and make decisions. This is not a dictatorship. She is telling Abraham, let's do this, let's do this. And he is discerning and thinking, and he's agreeing with her. But it also tells us this, which the culture doesn't tell us. Women are wrong often as men are. Women are sinners. The culture will make you think that the world is riddled with men who are buffoons and wives who know better. This is what every sitcom says. It's not what Scripture says. Scripture says you're equally buffoons, right? Take comfort in your buffoonery. And so this is a reminder to us there. Sarah is free to be emotional and make decisions and help Abraham, but she's also free to be wrong because she's a sinner. The third and final part of Sarah's, and there's so much more, of Abraham and Sarah's story, is a few chapters later when now the baby has grown. Hagar has had Ishmael, they have had Isaac, and Ishmael, this child from the slave woman, begins to snicker and kind of cause trouble with and laugh at Isaac, and Sarah doesn't like it. So Sarah goes to Abraham and says, send this woman and her kid away, get rid of them. Abraham struggles at first because, understandably, this is still his son, Ishmael. So he is being a proper dad by saying, yeah. But what happens? God comes and says, Abraham, Sarah's right this time. Send them packing. Now, we won't talk about all that. We can talk much more. Here's what we do know. This part is embarrassing to Jewish scholars. Jewish scholars, especially of the time, despised this because they couldn't understand why. They couldn't admit, kind of like Salieri, they couldn't admit that a woman had corrected a man and God agreed. So it's almost shocking when you read guys like Philo and Didymus the blind, these commentators in the ancient world. They say things that are shocking. They say things like, it wasn't really Sarah who was right, it was the virtue within her that was right. Therefore, a woman didn't correct a man, it was the virtue of God speaking through her. My friends, we would rather change and ignore Scripture than admit that our assumptions are wrong. We do it all the time. Now, Peter doesn't seem to have that problem. Have you noticed that? Peter doesn't qualify. He says, be like Sarah. If you want to know what it means to be submissive, look at Sarah. Is Sarah a weak woman? No. Is she stopping, not speaking up? Is she cowering under the hand of Abraham? No. Is she right all the time? Certainly not. But is it a proper marriage where people are sinners, working through life and screwing up a lot? Yep. And so what does it mean to submit? Yes, ultimately this is what we know. Scripture never, ever once says, husbands, submit to your wives. And we say, oh, patriarchy. No. I think when we stand before God, we'll be asked different questions. Husbands will be asked something like this. How did you love the family that God gave you? This is what I ask you as well. How are you making them radiant? That's the question. I'll have to account for my family. And for you, as I'm a pastor, I've made it even worse for myself. Now I have to say, look at these hundreds of people who have trusted me. Here's what I've made with them. That's a burden, an incredible burden for a man. And the wife will have a similar question, but not the same question, because she's not the head. She'll be asked, how did you serve and support your husband in his calling to make you and his children radiant? So when he was doing well, did you encourage him and tell him how wonderful he's doing? When he was struggling, did you correct him so that he would actually be corrected and not just chastise him? We both have different functions in the marriage. To pretend like we don't is a problem, and this is where I'm going to close now. It's attractive. So the Christian idea of marriage affirms parts of the culture, but then it also pushes and challenges it, which we've just seen. But it's also the most beautiful possible thing. And I'm going to pick on men just a little longer. I hope I don't go too long, because I'm going to start talking here. Okay, so C.S. Lewis, years ago, just after the war, the Second World War, writes an article for a newspaper. And in it, he says, I was worried, he says. He says he was worried that after the First World War, we had coddled young men so much that I didn't think they would rise to the occasion when the Second War came. And he said, because we take chivalry and courage for granted. We think that if we treat men a certain way and don't nurture their being actual men, that they will just be men when they have to be, right? You know what our baseball team found out this year? A lot of people thought that they could just all of a sudden play baseball again after 60 years of doing nothing. Me too. I pulled a hamstring. It was terrible. Because I assumed that years of inactivity and neglecting who I was would just all of a sudden be there when I needed it. My stamina will be like it was when I was 19. It wasn't. And Lewis says the same thing occurs with bravery in men. If we are not careful and we build men without chests, he calls them, men without chests, what happens when another Hitler arises? Who are we going to call upon? And I'll tell you, this is just me, okay? This is not scripture. You could disagree with me if you'd like. But here's where I will put my 2 cents in. When I walk around the world and I look at the men that we are producing, I am not encouraged. And I'm not saying this is a macho way, as you're going to see. But when I see men who are more concerned with video games than they are with being good men who can serve their families and their world, I have a problem. When I see the lack of work ethic in young men, I have a problem. When I see how they are self-absorbed, I have a problem. And so I start to wonder the same thing Lewis did. And why is it that men are so restless now? Why is it that young men are going to the church greater numbers than women for the first time in history? Why is it that we are so taken by seemingly strong men like Joe Rogan and Andrew Tate and Mark Driscoll and these pastors who espouse this manliness? Here's why I think it's happening and how we should fix it. There's 3 views of man, of what a man should be. Let's go with the pagan one. The early ancient one that the Romans would have understood was the pagan man. The pagan man is a warrior. The man of the ancient world, to be a man was to be Achilles, right? It was to be, who else? Attila the Hun. It was to be a Roman. The Romans were such men that they would parade their captives through the streets when they conquered somebody, and then when the parade was over, they took them behind a wall and slit their throats. Because men are brutish. Men, you know you're a man when you're a brute in the ancient world. That doesn't mean they're always brutes, but in general, manhood was determined this way. Because the pagans believed that if you let a man be natural and feral, he would become a man. But the problem is this: a natural man grows wild. And we know from all the world wars and the wars we've had that the best possible soldiers are often the ones who come home and struggle to adapt. Why? Because natural man is not a virtuous man. So, because this manhood has been pushed back in us, we want him back. So we want the UFC fighter. We want the man who is a brute because we miss him. He's been cut out of our psyche for so long because what has replaced him is the modern man. And the modern man, sorry, I know it sounds very, let me explain what I do here. I know those pictures, I knew they were going to give you trouble. So, the modern man is an androgynous man. Let me explain what I mean by that. We spoke earlier. What we're being told increasingly in the last 40, 50 years, certainly in the last 20, is this. There is the brutish man, the pagan man, is a toxic man that we got to get rid of because he is the root of all of human problems. Pagan man, get rid of him. So what we have to do then is we want to be so sure men never become that way again. Let's erase gender distinctions. That you may think you like adventure. Listen, I have 5 boys. Trust me, they like to fight. But you may think, but that's just a cultural hangover. We can rub it out of them eventually. Let's remove the stereotypes. Let's stop saying that men want to be police and women want to be homemakers. And I'm not even promoting a traditional view. It's not what I'm doing here. I'm simply showing that modern man is not a man. He is like Ken. It sounds terrible. He has no genitalia. That sounds terrible, but I'm sorry. Modern man is not wild like pagan man, but he is emasculated. Right? They make him a buffoon, they make him androgynous, or they make him whatever. But he's not a man. Is it any wonder that when we are being told that as men, that when Andrew Tates, these scoundrels of the world, rise up, we're like, that's the guy we want to be? Of course, because we've been told we're not men, but it's not true. Men are men, women are women. Now, if that's the case, what is the answer? The answer is the Christian man. This man, and I'll use an example because it's not just, of course it's to be Christ-like, but an example of it in history was this knight, Lancelot. If you've read the King Arthur myths, now I know there's no man is perfect here, but there's something that occurs in these King Arthur stories and about Lancelot, this knight, this medieval knight. And when he dies, his best friend, one of his best friends, comes and eulogizes him. And what he says in the eulogy is this: "Thou wert the meekest man that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." Now what he's saying is this. He is saying, Lancelot was the sort of man who was so comfortable with women that he was fine in living with women and being around them and being dainty and being kind and meek and gentle. But he also knew when to fight. The man who is the perfect Christian man, like Christ, knows when it's time to unsheath the sword and when it's time to put it away. Not one who says, I don't need the sword or I never need to be kind. It's both. Lewis, speaking about this exact thing about Lancelot, says this: "The important thing about this ideal is, of course, the double demand it makes on our human nature. The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and ragged stumps of lopped-off limbs. He is also a demure, almost maiden-like guest in a hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He is not a compromise or happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth degree and meek to the nth. When Lancelot heard himself pronounced as the best knight in the world, he wept as he had been a child that had been beaten." This is what we're being called to do as men, and marriages would be better. All of us have to do it, not just men and women, but as a man, I feel much more comfortable hammering us. We need to be more like Christ. See, the pagan model is natural but brutal. The modern model is unnatural and impossible to attain. The Christian model is unnatural. It's completely unnatural to us, but it is possible because of Christ. Because Christ comes, and he is just as comfortable staring down death and hell for you and overturning tables and facing the Roman Empire. That's a man who is brave. It's a God who is wonderful. But he's also the one who speaks to the woman at the well, and she says, I've never been understood like this man. How can he be both? Exactly. How can we be both? Because he died for us and sends his Spirit to live in us. If we are Christians, friends, it's very simple. Wives, you can trust God and submit to your husbands. But men, you have the Spirit of God in you. Live accordingly and arise. Stop pretending like you don't have the living God in you. And if you're a skeptic, I'd say this as well. You can't just take these principles and apply them to your life. Sometimes skeptics will come and say, well, I like the principles, I agree. I don't believe all this Jesus stuff, but I do like the fact that I want a marriage where we're mutually trying to outdo each other in loving one another. That's a good marriage. That part we've got right. Let's just try that. Listen, if you try that, it won't last very long because it'll be 5 minutes before the wife says, he's just taking advantage of me. And it's only 5 minutes before the man says, it doesn't matter how great I am, she just still doesn't trust me, she still nags me. So you in your own power will never have this sort of a marriage. The only possible way to be anywhere near what Christ is calling, what Peter is calling us to be, is if we repent and believe and have the Spirit of God in us, helping us along, so that we can become more like Christ. This is something of what he's trying to tell us here. Let's pray.